I'm more excited to be here with our terrific panel. So I am Judith Judson. I am Vice President and Head of U.S. Strategy for National Grid. National Grid is a principal partner of the UK government in COP26, and it's a pleasure to be here to moderate this panel on opportunities for collaboration in economic development and offshore wind. So National Grid has been supporting the work to combat climate change for decades. As a utility company that serves 20 million people across the US Northeast, we see it as our duty and privilege to find solutions for all the customers that we serve to ensure they have clean, fair, and affordable energy long into the future. We are fortunate to be located in the US Northeast, where the states we serve have some of the most ambitious and progressive environmental targets in the country, and where they're looking to transform the energy sector and have made tremendous progress, reducing emissions by 20% below 1990 levels. In order to tackle the remaining emissions, we need to make two shifts. One is to continue to change our energy supply, and that's where offshore wind comes into play, and also to change the way customers use energy, particularly in transportation and the building sectors. The US has the potential to be a world leader in offshore wind. And we see that there's a great deal to be gained from the deployment of offshore wind projects in our region, like economic and job creation opportunities for our coastal cities. And offshore wind has a significant opportunity along the East Coast in particular, and many of our eastern states have set ambitious targets for the development of additional offshore wind capacity in the years ahead. So I am pleased to be joined by 4 of our state leaders from the eastern part of the United States. We have Kathleen Theoharides, Secretary of the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. We have Jeremy Tarr, Senior Advisor for Climate Change Policy for the North Carolina Governor's Office, Governor Roy Cooper. And we have Doreen Harris, President and CEO of NYSERDA, and Ben Grumbles, Secretary of the Maryland Department of the Environment. I am going to ask each of our state leaders to start off by giving about 3 to 5 minutes of remarks on what your state is doing to support the development of offshore wind, supporting the industry, and where do things currently stand? And I'll start with Secretary Theoharides.
Well, thank you, Judith, and a pleasure to be with all of you this morning. Massachusetts saw the opportunity for offshore wind early back in 2016 after signing bipartisan energy legislation, and with that legislation we became a first mover in terms of offshore wind. The pricing that we got for our first 800 megawatt project I think blew everyone out of the water and really triggered this rush to offshore wind development up and down the eastern seaboard. So at this point we have 800 megawatts that is close to construction. When I get back, there's actually finally a groundbreaking event, and we'll start building that project, or Vineyard Wind will start building that project. We have now in federal permitting our second Mayflower Wind project, another 800 megawatt project, and our Department of Energy Resources is now in the process of reviewing bids for up to 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind. As we've been building our offshore wind program, we've also been charting a course to net zero and looking at what changes we need to make across our economy, across our energy supply to hit that target. And one of the things that's very clear across all of the pathways we looked at to get to offshore wind, to get to net zero, is that we need significant offshore resources, and that is a low cost way to get there. So we're looking at 15 to 25 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050. And what that means in the 2030s is permitting and building about 1,000 megawatts of offshore wind every year, which is a lot more than we've done to date. So really ramping up the pace and giving the development supply chain and the rest of it some certainty that this is going to be a key resource in Massachusetts and up and down the eastern seaboard. As we move forward, we've been looking at increasingly ways to locate the supply chain and the jobs in Massachusetts, and also make the transition to this clean energy resource in an equitable way that brings everyone along, especially environmental justice communities. And so our Clean Energy Center and our Department of Energy Resources has been focusing on investment in ports. Governor Baker filed legislation that would put $100 million toward ports and another $750 million from the recovery money that came to each of the states after COVID towards a clean energy fund that would go to the Clean Energy Center and really work to train the next generation of workers in offshore wind and also invest in pilots and technology development. So looking forward to the next phase of bringing this resource to Massachusetts.
Terrific. And next we have Jeremy Tarr.
Good morning, everybody, and greetings from North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper. For those of you who aren't aware of North Carolina, in 1903, Orville and Wilbur Wright invented the first motor-operated airplane on the coast of North Carolina, and they chose North Carolina because of our consistent and strong wind resource. Over 100 years later, we're tapping that same resource for a new emerging technology industry with offshore wind off of the Atlantic coast of the United States. So we're very excited about the prospects off of North Carolina and all along the Atlantic coast. In North Carolina, we see a clean and healthy environment go hand in hand with economic development. Governor Cooper is committed to addressing the urgency of climate change, and we see our overarching transition to a clean energy economy in a way that will enhance economic growth and jobs for the state, also address the climate challenge, and do so by transitioning our entire economy to a clean energy economy. And offshore wind is a key part of that. Over the past couple of years, we've taken a number of really deliberate steps to move us toward a clean energy transition. In 2018, Governor Cooper issued an executive order that really set us on a course for this by setting goals and directing strategic plans in key sectors. A year later, our Department of Environmental Quality and Climate Change Interagency Council finalized the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan, which had a number of recommendations for all sectors of the clean energy economy, including offshore wind. Just this summer, Governor Cooper issued an offshore wind specific executive order that set the first offshore wind targets for development off of the North Carolina coast. By 2040, 8 gigawatts of development and 2.8 gigawatts of development by 2030. So we're very excited about the path forward. As we'll talk, Secretary Grumbles and I am sure we'll talk about the Smart Power Memorandum of Understanding that our governor signed with Governor Hogan, Governor Cooper, and Governor Northam from Virginia. And we're working together as a region to bring the offshore wind industry to our states, and we see economic opportunities for each of our individual states when we work together. So we're very excited to continue working with our partners. We think North Carolina has a lot to offer. We're number one in manufacturing along the East Coast and among southeastern states. We have high quality marine and manufacturer training. We have 58 community colleges campuses across the state, which are located in a way that each North Carolinian is within 30 minutes of a community college to be able to receive training programs to help us feed the supply chain of offshore wind. We have 2 deep water ports that are have resources and opportunity to expand to accommodate the offshore wind industry. So we're really excited about prospects moving forward and are learning from our states along the East Coast and plowing our own course at the same time. So thank you for having us on the panel.
Thank you. That's great to hear about. And Doreen Harris, would you like to go next?
Sure. Good morning. I represent Governor Hochul in the state of New York, where we have still the largest offshore wind goal in the nation. 9 gigawatts by 2035. And interestingly, I also co-chair our Climate Action Council, which is set forth pathways to achieve our Climate Act goals. And in doing so, some of the modeling for the longer term actually looks a lot like Massachusetts, where we're anticipating goals of upwards of 20 gigawatts by 2050. So certainly it's a game changer already for a state like New York, even though obviously we have a, a significant amount of electric load. Offshore wind, the goal we have now would serve about a third of that load. So I think it's true that many states see offshore wind as really a facilitator of the ability to achieve the deep decarbonization we all seek. In addition, I think we're just scratching the surface as to its opportunity. Kind of like phase 2 of offshore wind begins to facilitate those sectors of the economy, I think, that are really difficult to decarbonize, like transport, heavy duty transport, buildings, industry, and the like. So I think it's really just the beginning for all of us. But in our state, we have contracts, 5 projects under contract and under development. We too have a ribbon cutting. The South Fork Wind Farm is going to be entering construction very shortly. It's a small but mighty little project that's moving forward for us. But then we have 4 additional projects that are contracted with NYSERDA for development, altogether getting us to about half of our 9 gigawatt goal now. With respect to supply chain, very early on, we took a very aggressive stance toward attracting industry to New York State. And in fact, now we have 5 ports that are going to be delivering components or serving the industry all the way from the tip of Long Island up to the capital region of New York State. So that's good news and something we certainly want to build on. And so we've announced early next year, we'll be issuing our next offshore wind solicitation. I'm hopeful that we can do what we did last time that worked very well, which is to invest hundreds of millions of dollars of capital in ports alongside that RFP. We ran an RFP last year that included those components, and I think the results were pretty good. We have a tower manufacturing facility, transmission pieces going in the capital region. We have a staging port in Brooklyn, and more to come. So I think when I think about our goals, I think honestly offshore wind is the reason we can legitimately say we're going to achieve them. And I think personally, it's great to see all the states coming together here in Europe. We can see this around the North Sea. And I think we're setting up a similar ecosystem here, well, in the US. So it's great to talk about one of my favorite topics.
Thank you, Doreen. And Ben, would you like to go next?
So I'm Ben Grumbles. I'm Governor Larry Hogan's Environment Secretary, and I'm proud to be wearing the Maryland Energy Administration's wind socks. I'll just stop right there. Offshore wind is a godsend for Maryland. We are a small but mighty state surrounding the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., but also having a significant portion of our economy and our culture along the Atlantic Ocean, in particular Ocean City and the coastal areas. And for us, everything started coming together a few years ago. Our Public Service Commission, Governor Hogan's administration with its very strong climate ambition, and one of the nation's strongest renewable portfolio standards. And onshore wind is not a big option for us in Maryland. So with recent developments, with the signing of the Smart Power MOU with our great neighbors and partners, North Carolina and Virginia, it set Maryland on a course over the last year to really focus on not just our climate ambition, but on the economy. Maryland's slogan under Governor Hogan is Maryland is open for business. It's also open for entirely new industries, clean industries. And so offshore wind, we've been partnering with US Wind and with Ørsted. And so we have a couple projects underway, not yet started, but the assembling and the preparing and getting everything in motion is happening. And so by 2026, we will be getting clean energy from the offshore wind. The other point to make, which is so critical, particularly as we look at a post-COVID economy in Maryland, this effort is bringing new jobs. There's a renaissance of green steel, the steel that's going to be used for the wind projects are being assembled. And so we have manufacturing in a portion of Baltimore that used to be making steel for the war effort many years ago. And so this is a wonderful story of the clean energy economy creating jobs. And between U.S. Wind and Ørsted, which has really been a major leader in the U.S. as well as around the world, we're seeing jobs for those who need them the most and bringing manufacturing for a new and clean industry to Maryland. And Governor Hogan and his administration are very excited about the possibilities. And also, it just feels right to be partnering in a regional collaboration in a totally bipartisan manner. We're familiar to that in partnering with New York and Massachusetts in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is one of the best examples of cap and invest throughout the world. And partnering with North Carolina and Virginia as well on smart power and offshore wind is very exciting. Thank you very much.
That is great to hear about. It is so exciting to see all the initiatives that the states are taking to develop the offshore wind industry. And we're also excited to see what's happening at the federal level. Of course, President Biden was here last week. There's exciting announcements being made. The United States is on a path now and a commitment to net zero by 2050. And there's also been a goal set for 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And there's been a roadmap developed by the federal government to achieve that goal. It would be great to hear from each of you how what the federal government is doing and those recent actions are supporting what you're doing at the state level. And let's just start again with Secretary Theoharides.
Well, we are absolutely thrilled with the focus the new administration has taken on offshore wind, and it couldn't have come at a better time. We actually had our first project stuck in the permitting process, and Amanda Lefton, who's the director of BOEM, her first day on the job, she moved that project forward back into the permitting process, and so that sped things along. I think, you know, there are a number of important signals they have sent to the industry, including the 30 gigawatt target, which basically adds up all of the state's goals and for procurement at this point. But there is also significant funding available for port infrastructure, for offshore wind clusters and development opportunities through economic development grants. And I think there is a commitment from the feds to scheduling or creating a schedule of how they're going to permit new projects and also open up new lease areas. And so one of the most exciting announcements a couple of weeks ago from Secretary Haaland was a plan going forward to open up additional wind lease areas from all the way from the Gulf of Maine around through the Gulf of Mexico and up to Oregon and along the California coast. And so that's really a key step in actually meeting this 30 gigawatt goal that they've set.
I'd echo the Secretary's points about BOEM being a great partner and really listening to states from day one, and the President Biden's leadership at you know, at the department and Director Lefton has just been really helpful for us. BOEM has been very active off of our coast, and we appreciate that. I guess three points. One, Avangrid Renewables is developing a 2.4-ish gigawatt project called the Kitty Hawk project off the northeastern coast of North Carolina, and they're going through the construction operation plan process right now. Second, BOEM recently announced the proposed sale notice for Wilmington East, which is about 1.5 gigawatts, and they plan to hold a lease auction in the spring of 2022. So that's going to be a big and positive next step for the state. And like the Secretary said, BOEM is starting to look at identifying new wind energy areas, and we have a lot of space between the two projects I just mentioned in the central part of our offshore wind, our outer continental shelf areas. So we're really excited about that. The federal funding coming down for offshore wind related activities is extremely helpful. Again, the port infrastructure grants is something that we are applying to. The Build Back Better regional grant opportunity through the Economic Development Administration is a huge opportunity, and we're working with Virginia and Maryland and have submitted an application there to really help establish the Mid-Atlantic as a manufacturing hub for all along the East Coast of the United States. So yeah, they've been great partners, and you know, it's an ongoing relationship. We did it together, yeah.
Trying to build on, totally agree with all the points that were made. I am incredibly encouraged by the federal government's actions thus far. There's a lot on their plate. They have a lot to do. They have a lot of projects to permit. And frankly, we don't have enough space in the ocean right now identified to reach these goals. Like by far, we don't have enough. So I do think there's a challenge ahead as to sort of moving the existing projects forward while still continuing to fill that pipeline with new lease areas. In New York, it was 2018 that we recommended areas for leasing in the New York Bight, identifying that exact issue and really wanting to move that leasing forward. Here we are, it's the end of 2021, and I'm assured that early 22 will bring new lease areas to the Bight. I hope that they are of sufficient scale to, at a minimum, hit, as I would call them, these phase 1 goals for our region. But it is true that there is a mounting tension, even between states, as to this lease scarcity. So I think, you know, for us, very encouraged. Amanda Lefton used to be the Secretary of Environment and Energy in New York State. So certainly she comes with an acknowledgement of the state issues to that role. However, I do think the pace that we are keeping is tricky for them to keep up with. And I do think, as a general matter, we're seeing project delays as a result of permitting delays. And that's challenging for our market as we're trying to build that scale and durability that is needed to make the investments that we all seek. With that said, looking forward, there are many aspects of its offshore wind's development that we now see the federal government engaging within, and I see it in a very optimistic light. So as a general matter, it's certainly a better day than it was 2 years ago, and I really am excited about more to come.
Thank you. Well, for us in Maryland, with the new federal administration in place, we feel like we really do have the wind at our backs, and the support, not just with BOEM and the licensing, the environmental review and permitting process at the federal level, but also, as Jeremy mentioned, the emphasis on port infrastructure. So the bipartisan infrastructure plan, Governor Hogan welcomed Secretary Buttigieg of the Transportation Department in Baltimore, which is a key regional hub for manufacturing, and so keeping the arteries of commerce open and clean to bring in the materials that can be assembled for this clean and green industry, including steel manufacturing, is very important. And the federal government, from BOEM to Department of Transportation to EPA and others, who are cheering on for states to really take the lead for clean and renewable energy and climate goals being achieved. So we're very encouraged.
All right, that is terrific to hear. Of course, with any ambitious target, there's challenges, but it sounds like a tremendous amount of progress is being made, and there's federal support for all the activity happening at the state level. So now maybe let's turn to the supply chain. And I will start with Doreen for this one. And what is your approach to securing supply chain services to local and, to be local and within your state?
Yeah, it's an area that New York has placed a strong emphasis on from the beginning. And in fact, even our first procurement, for which we contracted our Empire and Sunrise Wind projects, came with quite significant investments, both in ports and in supply chain activities. It is true, though, that it is necessary to leverage public dollars with private dollars in, I think, a very creative way in order to realize these investments. Really, when we really think about it, there are not a huge number of decisions made with respect to supply chain that are made by the developers themselves. Certainly some scopes are within their control, but really what we have taken a very deliberate approach to is looking deeper within the supply chain to the OEMs and the tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers alike. And I think when we really get to those points, what those suppliers are looking to do is to invest in areas where they know, again, they will have that durability of scale and opportunity that can afford them that investment, but that they are also partnering with us as a state. We put, again, hundreds of millions of dollars on the table. And the interesting thing is we look at the leverage that creates. It's about a 3-to-1 ratio, private to public investments. So what we have learned as a state is that if we are willing to invest and provide that certainty, the market will respond with appropriate scopes that can fit rationally within our state. So at the moment, we certainly have operations and maintenance activities, staging activities, and now we've moved into the foundation / tower / transition piece manufacturing up in the capital region. But I do think there's more to come. I think we together have created a market that can really sustain substantial investments by suppliers. And that's something I'm really excited about. This is not something that these suppliers look at on a state by state basis. It is true that we will source components from other states, and that's altogether a good thing. But it has been a focus of ours, and I really do expect it to continue into the coming years.
That's terrific to hear about. Does anyone else want to comment on that?
Where we started was with a supply chain and infrastructure assessment that BVG and Associates completed for North Carolina, led by the Department of Commerce about this time last year. And that really helped us understand the scale of opportunity and where North Carolina can compete and where we're not competitive. So we're really focusing our energy in strategic places. One of the big takeaways from that report was, this was a year ago, it projected 41 gigawatts of development off the Atlantic coast by 2035. That would result in $140 billion of investment to build that out. And we found that North Carolina can compete for 100 billion of that pie. And so we are working collaboratively across state agencies and other entities in North Carolina to make sure we're well positioned and are coordinated in taking advantage of those opportunities. So that includes opportunities for recruiting to North Carolina, but also expanding business opportunities for companies that are already in North Carolina, who may not realize that actually the part that they make could be used for offshore wind turbines, or they could adjust their processes a little to be really helpful. So we have our Economic Development Partnership in North Carolina, the Governor's Office, our Department of Environmental Quality, our Department of Commerce, our Department of Transportation, community colleges. We meet regularly, our ports, to share information, share best practice, and make sure that we are coordinated. We think our community college system that I mentioned earlier and our pretty flexible training programs are a real asset. Working again with Maryland, North Carolina, and Virginia through the Smart Power MOU is something that when we talk about with industry, we see a lot of heads nodding. Companies coming from Europe, it's easy for us in the United States to get confused about all the regulatory requirements. Each state is this, different, this and that. But we're working right now to identify, for example, our regional assets and gaps so that we can speak with one voice to companies, where our environmental departments are working together to identify kind of permitting requirements and clarify where they're the same across the states, where they're different, and help streamline them where we can. So yeah, we're just, really trying to be deliberate in developing our supply chain in North Carolina. I mean, one example of success is, we're excited about the offshore wind development off of Maryland, off of Massachusetts. Recently, a North Carolina company, Southwire, who's located out of Huntersville, North Carolina, just north of Charlotte, won a contract to provide onshore high voltage cables to a Vineyard Wind project. So that's an example of how development off of other states' coasts really helps all of us, and we can feed the supply chain along the Atlantic coast.
Excellent.
Maybe just picking up on something Doreen said in the last comment, which I think is really important, is these new wind lease areas, because the predictability and the pipeline of projects is really key to attracting certainly OEMs and supply chain development in any state up and down the coast. In Massachusetts, we really believe one of our sweet spots is the academic institutions, community colleges, vocational and technical schools that we have, and the people power we have in this industry. So we see ourselves as a workhorse of training this next generation of workers, and retraining workers in other spaces to come into the wind field. And that's been a large focus of some of the investments we've made on the state side. We started our procurement with a real focus on price, and we're not losing that as we move forward. But we have seen since 2016, when the governor signed the bipartisan energy legislation that established our authority and procurement process for offshore wind, that the market has matured, and there are some changes we can make to update that procurement process to really put more emphasis on economic development, on environmental feasibility for these projects, and also on creating a diverse and equitable and inclusive workforce. And so the governor has filed new legislation a few weeks ago that would update that procurement process. It would lift our price cap, and it would put more emphasis on those three areas I mentioned when we're considering the contracts. And so something we're excited about. And the other piece that I mentioned earlier that is part of the legislation as well is this $750 million innovation fund for the Clean Energy Center that would go directly towards creating new opportunities for supply chain companies, for pilots and innovation, and really push this industry forward. A key part of all of this is our ports, and so we've done significant work to understand strategically the opportunities available at all of the ports in Massachusetts that could serve the industry, what they're best suited for in terms of their location, and what they need in terms of upgrades. And so, we have one purpose-built port now, but we see that expanding significantly in the future, particularly as we contemplate floating turbines in the Gulf of Maine. So a lot of work to do going forward, but a lot of opportunity as well.
All I would emphasize, because everyone's touched on this, and the critical role of the supply chain, is that when North Carolina and Virginia and Maryland governors signed the MOU on smart power for the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic, put a real focus on working together. I mean, states can be very competitive, as you know, but when you work together to benefit all of the region, to remove some of the kinks or uncertainties in the procurement and in staging and streamlining the regulatory process, which is very important and benefits from collaboration. That's great. And so for Maryland, Governor Larry Hogan is very pleased. Orsted, they launched the very first assembly point in Maryland for the wind turbines at the site now called Trade Point Atlantic, which used to be Sparrows Point, where Bethlehem Steel was. And so now you have that exciting new opportunity. And near the coast, you have a new operations and maintenance facility that's emission-free that Ørsted broke ground on. So a lot of things to be excited about, with a real emphasis on the economic benefits as well as the environmental.
Yeah, it is so exciting to hear about all the economic development activity happening, the jobs, the collaboration about jobs. You know, one of the things that we faced over the last couple of years, of course, was COVID, when a lot of concern about jobs and economic recovery. And we have heard the view that the timing of the emerging offshore wind industry presents a unique opportunity for COVID pandemic recovery. So maybe I'll start with Katie. And do you see it that way, or will the greatest economic and job benefits of the offshore wind industry be realized post-recovery?
So we really see the clean energy space generally as a key part of our economic recovery from COVID. And to that end, Governor Baker has put forward a plan that includes significant American Recovery Act dollars for ports, for investments in clean energy innovation and technology, and for creating this new workforce. And, you know, I think one of the key lessons learned over the course of the pandemic was how important the environment was in terms of the resiliency, in terms of people being able to get outside, and in thinking about air pollution and how it affects our health. And so the idea that the go forward with these dollars should be reinvested, not just in getting people back to work and stimulating the economy, but really building the environment that we want to see in the future and solving our problem, our climate change problem, while we're at it. So I think this is a key opportunity moving out of the pandemic.
Perfect. Does anyone else want to comment on that?
Well, I think one thing that's pretty awesome that I see coming out of the federal government is this very close alignment with some of the principles that some of these states, and I think others to come, have embodied in our procurements and in our generally in our clean energy policy. And that is a strong alignment of the industry with organized labor as in the first instance, looking at some of the provisions we might see with tax credits. Fingers crossed, there's very specific language that would incur greater benefits to those who pay prevailing wage and who are essentially building their projects in concert with, as I said, with unions. And so that's actually part of NYSERDA's procurements. It's been for a long time a requirement for the negotiation of project labor agreements and the payment of prevailing wage. So I think that's one point with respect to jobs, is that there is good alignment, and of course there's the scale to realize that alignment. The other piece, though, that is probably even more important is that I know we're all committed to building an industry that is far more inclusive than the industry that we have today in the energy sector. And I know many of our policies have principles that are much aligned with the Justice 40 initiatives in the federal government. Where there is not only a requirement, but a need to bring significant benefits to underserved communities, but also to bring forth programs that are focused on, again, I would say, rebalancing the wrongs of the past. So with that said, I think as we build this economy and as we realize the jobs that we collectively can, I'm really personally quite excited about the issue of equity being central collectively between the states and the federal government.
Great to hear. Go ahead.
I was going to echo all three of those points about the importance of federal money, about family sustaining wages, and about equity. You know, with the 2020s are going to be pretty exciting in the United States on offshore wind, with all of the development we've been talking about. But at the same time, you have historic kind of federal investments through recovery packages, through the infrastructure bill, and where both of those are going to put a lot of money flow through states. We're also going to see a lot of competitive grant opportunities, some of which we've mentioned today. So there's a real opportunity to invest that money in a way that is not just gives historically underserved communities opportunities to participate, but affirmatively benefits them. One of the things we're doing in North Carolina, our Department of Commerce in the next little bit is going to announce, going to launch the North Carolina Task Force for Offshore Wind Economic Resources, the acronym being NC Towers. And so on NC Towers, where it's going to represent, is really focused on economic development and offshore wind, and we're going to have a diversity of views on there, including representatives from environmental justice communities, and to make sure that their voices are a part of our strategy moving forward for investments, and make sure everyone has an opportunity to compete for the supply chain. So we're very excited about that, and plan to work forward in that respect as well.
All right, thank you. Well, let's continue on this focus a little bit on regional coordination among the states. And of course, it's been a theme of what we're talking about today. And it's very important for the development of offshore wind, but also for the transmission that supports and will deliver that offshore wind to our customers and residents and businesses in our states. We have seen examples here in Europe of large offshore wind installations. Of course, the UK has been a leader in collaborating on transmission and interconnection of those resources. So it would be great to hear if there's any good examples we can draw from, particularly being here at COP26, with the experience that Europe has had with offshore wind, either on the transmission or other areas, supply chain. And be great to hear from all your perspectives about how you're thinking about that. And maybe we start with Secretary Grumbles.
Well, regional collaboration is key in all aspects of achieving our climate ambition. As a state, we're very proud of our very detailed economy-wide greenhouse gas reduction strategy, and a key component of it is renewable energy, and hopefully at some point a clean energy standard in the state, which we're working on. But for getting clean energy to the homes and businesses throughout the region, I think we're at a learning stage, and the more we can learn from other countries and regions, that'll translate into more success in the Southeast and the mid-Atlantic, where Maryland is. So we're very excited about it, and we know that it takes a partnership. I'm with the environmental department in the state, so learning from the Energy Agency and the Public Service Commission and what other states and nations are doing on that front is important, and our legislature is following it closely as well, not just for the jobs and the environmental justice component, but how can we get more success in clean energy. I'm very familiar with whether it's wind or solar. Sometimes the great challenge is getting the electricity to where the people are. So that's a key component that we cannot lose sight of.
Just to elaborate a little more on the Smart Power MOU, which we've mentioned a couple of times, the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic Regional Transformative Partnership for Offshore Wind Energy Resources has been about a year. We have about a year under us, and we work together to kind of develop and expand the offshore wind industry development and economic and supply chain opportunities. Here's some of the things we're working on right now together. So we've kind of mentioned the idea of promoting our region as one, and to do that, we're doing a asset and gap analysis so we can sort of speak with one voice to industry. We communicate fairly regularly with one voice to the federal government so that they understand what we think would make sense as far as next steps. Where our universities are about to come together to really start to identify what the university researchers in North Carolina and Maryland and Virginia are working on, where there are collaborations, how they can work with industry, so that's sort of industry directed or relevant research, and again mentioned the clarifying and streamlining the environmental regulatory requirements among the states. So those, we're trying to ensure that this MOU isn't just a press release, it's something we're really working on. We meet quarterly so that we're kind of following through on the promise of it.
Perfect.
I think one example that many of us are aware of where we've come together that's really exciting to me is through our National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium, which is a coalition of states, but private entities as well, and in educational institutions with significant amounts of federal money, combining really to create an ecosystem for innovation investments that are driven by the private sector, but of course supported by the states and others in realizing those investments. I mean, it's not the case that everything is really well suited for collaboration. I don't want to pretend that it is, but I think in the situation or in the example of research and development, it certainly is, and we've demonstrated together that we can do more together than we would alone in that regard. We've talked a lot about supply chain. You asked specifically about transmission. Yeah, I've been spending a lot of time with the Danish government, really understanding how they're developing some of these grids here in the North Sea, or planning to, which would potentially connect multiple regions beyond what is already occurring. It's really, really amazing to learn about and to understand not only the process that they've gone through, but frankly, the market rules that would even allow it to happen. One really specific challenge we have, at least in my view, with respect to that type of planning occurring on the East Coast, sorry, but it all goes back to lease areas. It's a little difficult to plan a grid when you don't know where the projects are going to be located. And that's part of the challenge that we have, is that we don't want stranded assets delivering transmission to a project that doesn't exist, as an example. So that's why I really do see that visibility of lease areas as absolutely critical to trying to plan around it. Each state is taking different approaches with respect to transmission development. New Jersey, not represented here, has a pretty interesting approach that they're actually advancing now around, very specific transmission solutions for offshore wind. In our case, certainly with respect to our phase 1 projects, one thing we're doing, which I think is pretty interesting, is we're requiring them to be built so as to accommodate a future grid. So the technical design of the substations is required to be what we call mesh ready, meaning that it can eventually connect if and when there are policies and programs to do so. So that's sort of a mini step 1 as a result of some studies that we conducted over the last year or two. I think there's going to be a lot more to come in that respect. I think as we start to increase these goals and really look to the larger objectives, it is not the case that we're going to be able to continue to use these radial systems for numbers like 20 gigawatts. It's just not, it's not how it's going to work. But for now, frankly, we sort of have to walk and chew gum at the same time. We've got to execute on these procurements, and we've got to plan at the same time as well.
On the transmission piece, I really agree with Doreen. I mean, we see this as a key challenge for all of the resources we're trying to bring to the grid, and in addition to how we can work regionally on building onshore, the offshore and onshore transmission systems, we need to bring in the offshore wind. We are looking at how grid operators need to actually reform their transmission planning process to build in the clean energy goals and to plan out, and that's the bit to get that electricity into our system. So resource planning we see as a key piece of this, and we're in a regional grid that means and getting those states getting really on to what this should look like, to what market reform should look like, grid operators governance. Big challenge, but it's a key area of regional collaboration moving forward. And I think we all some of the goals and our grid is connected, so it benefits from all of the work states are doing to connect new resources into it. So more to come. A lot of work ahead on the transmission side, but a key part of this work going forward.
All right, excellent. Well, we are coming down to the final minutes of our panel today. Just wanted to check if anyone in the audience had any questions. Otherwise, I have a few more of my own. Yes. Great. So the question, if for anyone listening online, was around opportunities. We have a member of the audience from California. And so it'd be great to hear just what would you say to other states who are just starting this process? Of course, the East Coast has been a leader on this, but the West Coast is the next frontier for the United States in terms of offshore wind. Any lessons learned that you would share or best practices?
Well, I'd say one thing. First of all, I have my card. I'll give you a copy. I know we'd all be happy to help any way that we can. Certainly, a lot of our learnings came from Europe, and certainly to move to the West Coast, hopefully we can be equally useful. I know we'd all like to. What would I recommend? So back in 2016, I very much wanted New York State to develop to get a really big offshore wind goal going. That was my priority number one. But instead, I got an offshore wind master plan. And I said, ugh, now we have to plan. And in the end, it was the best decision that we ever made, because we then took time. We took a year or two to actually be ready to advance the resource in all respects. This is a super complicated resource to move forward. It touches all issues. We've talked about many in economic development, environment, transit, maritime operations, it just cost, of course, grid. The point being that really when one advances offshore wind, you need to do so in a way that is comprehensive and well thought out. And so over those years, not only did we conduct dozens and dozens of studies, but we also conducted a ton of outreach to local communities and to people who literally don't know the first thing about what offshore wind even is. So it's education, it's engagement, it's sort of understanding who's who in the market and who you'll be dealing with in advancing the resource. And I'd say that paid off in spades.
We kind of remind each and every face mask, but we're right for the nose at all times. During your time at the conference, unless you're seated in a room with appropriate distance. But eating or drinking or meditating. Thank you for your cooperation.
So we eventually got our goal, but the planning process continues to be extremely beneficial in its responsible effectuation.
I think that's a perfect answer. Also happy to share contact information. The other piece I would add to this sort of comprehensive look at what you need to locate the industry and to build out the projects is really taking the opportunity to understand the strategic positioning of your ports and what each can serve for. They may have different construction and operations, maintenance, part of the supply chain, and figuring out what those investments, what port investments you need to make, and what can be done sort of through private dollars, what can be done with public funding, and how to bring the resources to bear for those. I guess the other thing I'd say is none of this from our experience has been for the faint of heart. So it takes a little while to get started, but I do really think that we're moving forward with a lot of power, a lot of wind now behind us.
One additional point, you mentioned, I believe that you're with the Economic Development Incubator, Clean Tech Incubator. And so one of the things that, to the point about it's a complicated sort of array, bringing new industry to your state in a very complicated system requires a lot of people. So what we've found, and this is an ongoing process, is that having champions in different spaces is really a way to expand the awareness and the education. And then when folks get excited, the ripple effects, things, it sort of takes a life on its own. So whether that's in your transportation department, logistics, governor's office, legislature, local economic development officials, existing companies that can fit into the supply chain, the studies, the outreach, what we've seen is sort of it starts small, but then it can grow, really, really pretty quickly. There's also a great opportunity to learn from other states and other countries who are ahead of us, and to just do things a little more efficiently because we've learned from what's worked and what hasn't worked in those other jurisdictions.
Just simply, one of the challenges we haven't focused on directly, but is always real, depending on the location of the project, is tackling the concerns that some might have about view shed, and listening intently and laying out the information and the plans. That's a key component. It is an absolutely necessary one to a successful and sustainable project moving forward. And just the last one I would say is creating forums to share and learn from. I'm particularly, like all of us, are appreciative that the Climate Registry and the Climate Action Reserve are providing this forum, the Pathways to 1.5 Pavilion, where we hear from Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator and others around the world about how to move forward on offshore wind and other clean energy economy opportunities.
That's a perfect way to close, Ben. I just wanted to thank Judith before you close. Judith has personal experience doing this work as our former Department of Energy Resources Commissioner, oversaw our first procurement. So just a big thank you for moderating the panel.
Oh, well, thank you. And I can think of no better way to end than to talk about collaboration and the coordination and the education and the outreach, because it's really going to take bringing awareness and enabling the transition for all and ensuring no one is left behind. So thank you for that. Thanks. And thanks to all of you. This has been a great hour, and it's been terrific to see all the advancements that have been made at the state around offshore wind. Thank you.